Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Van Maren Show on LifeSiteNews.com. Today, I want to discuss an aspect of the abortion debate that's particularly disturbing and that most people probably are very unaware of. And that is the fact that many times in Canada, in the United States, and around the world, babies are actually born alive during abortion procedures and then left to die. And this caught my attention recently. Those of you who follow LifeSiteNews.com will know that LifeSite News has several reporters on the ground in San Francisco to cover the trial of David Daleiden, Sandra Merritt, Troy Newman, and a number of pro-lifers involved with the Planned Parenthood baby body part scandal. This is the scandal that broke in 2015, basically revealing the fact that the abortion industry was harvesting organs from babies and then selling them to biomedical companies. And one of the things that's just... I didn't think I could get more shocked by this story, to be honest. I reported on the story at the time. I've watched hours of footage from the Center for Medical Progress, but they actually have an abortionist on the stand in San Francisco to confirm that what the pro-lifers are saying is correct, that organizations like Planned Parenthood are altering the abortion procedure in order to harvest intact organs. You'll remember that one video talked about crushing the baby above and crushing the baby below the organs you want to keep intact for sale. And Dr. Forrest Smith, who's an abortionist who's done at least 50,000 abortions, has basically been stating that this is actually going on. He said, let me read you a quote here from the LifeSite News report on this. The accepted method for this type of abortion is to dilate the cervix by inserting laminaria or seaweed sticks 1 or 2 days before the abortion, depending on the baby's gestational age. Misoprostol can act as a cervical preparation agent in small doses of 25 to 100 milligrams to soften the cervix for an induction of a term pregnancy, Smith said, Forrest Smith being the abortionist. But large doses of 300 to 400 milligrams every 3 to 4 hours to induce labor for an abortion, as Planned Parenthood abortionists were apparently doing, will trigger tumultuous labor that will result in fetal expulsion, in which the, quote, fetus comes out without any assistance from the abortion doctor, no instrumentation, so they're not dismembering it. There's no question in my mind that at least some of these fetuses were live births, Smith said. It gets worse. Here's what World Magazine reported. And this is just brutal. On the final day of the hearing, that being the David Daleiden trial, stem cell scientist Teresa Daisher testified that fetal hearts used in studies must be harvested from living babies. She said the heart has to be beating and be arrested in a relaxed position, end quote. If the babies die beforehand, the heart contracts and cannot be used. Basically, to cut through what that means, it means that the baby hearts that are being sold to biomedical companies, this is proven. By the way, baby body parts are also harvested in Canada as well and used for experimentation, but that these hearts have to be harvested from the chests of living babies. Their hearts have to be cut out while they're beating. This is a monumental barbarism. This is a discussion happening in open court right now in San Francisco. And what have you heard about this? This should be breaking news on every TV network. It should be on the front page of every newspaper, and you're hearing almost nothing. So to discuss this issue with me, I asked my friend Jill Stanek to come on the show. Jill Stanek had a very strange route into the pro-life movement. She was working as a registered nurse when she realized that at the hospital where she worked, babies were being born alive and left to die after abortions. She has seen unbelievable and horrifying things. And so I wanted to have a discussion with her so that I wanted you to hear it from somebody who has seen it themselves. And so Jill Stanek, she was a well-known pro-life blogger for years, and she currently works for the Susan B. Anthony List. I love her very much. She's a friend of mine. She has seen unbelievable things, and so today's show is my conversation with Jill Stanek about the horrors of infanticide and the harvesting of baby body parts that are taking place right across North America. So just to start off, I wanted to share with you something that's been reported in several outlets about the David Daleiden trial that's currently going on in San Francisco over the baby body part scandal, which all of our listeners and viewers will be familiar with. And what's interesting about this case is they actually had an abortionist from California, Dr. Forrest Smith, who's done over 50,000 abortions, and they had him testify on behalf of the pro-lifers to confirm the accuracy of these videos. And there's not a whole lot that shocks me, but this line here actually from World Magazine really stuck out to me, especially because it's not being covered anywhere in the mainstream press. Nobody's talking about the gruesome details of this because they've been claiming the Daleiden videos are discredited ever since they broke in 2015, and so they can't really talk about the fact that there's an abortionist confirming this is the case. So here's the relevant quote. "Very few people in abortion outside of Planned Parenthood do that," said Dr. Forrest Smith on the stand. On the final day of the hearing, stem cell scientist Teresa Daisher testified that fetal hearts used in studies must be harvested from living babies. She said the heart, quote, "has to be beating and be arrested in a relaxed position. If the baby dies beforehand, the heart contracts and cannot be used," which basically means, so we knew they were aborting babies and they were harvesting the body parts. We knew that they were changing the abortion procedures to preserve certain body parts for use in experimentation. But I will admit that although I thought there was nothing that could shock me about this, the fact that they had to keep the babies alive to extract the beating hearts from their chest, that this is actually going on, this just stuns me. And the reason the mainstream media isn't covering this, of course, is because they can't. And so based on this story, I just wanted to know, this is something you've actually seen firsthand. There are many people who say, look, the abortion industry is very regulated. The abortion industry simply terminates pregnancies. But your entry into the pro-life movement was actually seeing a baby dying in a back room in a hospital. So I wanted to have you on the show to discuss what you saw with your own eyes. So everybody listening to the show who thinks that might be pro-lifers exaggerating, know that no, this is really happening. And this is happening way more often than people think.
Right. My story happened 20 years ago, Jonathan, but Governor Northam of Virginia made clear that this is still happening today. When he was trying to defend a wildly pro-abortion bill in Virginia earlier this year, he said during a radio interview, and he's a pediatric neurologist, and he said, and I'm quoting, and he's talking about third trimester abortions if the baby survives. He said, I can tell you exactly what happens. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother. Cutting through, the gobbledygook, he's saying that these babies, if they survive their abortions, they'll be set aside, supposedly made comfortable, and then the mom and the doctors will decide whether to resuscitate or not, whether to let the baby die or not. President Trump called it execution. That's what it would be. So what happened to me was that, and I saw this then from the other side of that decision, from the baby's perspective. I was a registered nurse in the labor and delivery department of Christ Hospital on the southwest side of Chicago in 1999 when I discovered that not only was a hospital involved in late-term abortions, but sometimes babies survived. And if they survived, they were left to die in the soiled utility room. Christ Hospital admitted to the Chicago Sun-Times that between 10 and 20% of babies aborted by this method survived. So that would be at least 1 in 5. So one night a nursing coworker was taking a little abortion survivor to our soiled utility room to die because the parents didn't want to hold him and she didn't have time to hold him that night. And when she told me what she was doing, I couldn't bear the thought of this suffering child dying alone. And so I did cradle and rock him for the 45 minutes that he lived. He was about 21, 22 weeks old. He was about the size of my hand, and he didn't move very much because he was using all of his energy attempting to breathe. And I remember toward the end of his life, I couldn't tell if he was alive or not unless I held him up against the light to see if I could see his heart beating through his chest wall, because their skin is so thin at that age. And after he was pronounced dead, 45 minutes later, I folded his little arms across his chest. I tied them together with a little string. I wrapped him in a shroud, and I took him to the morgue where we took all of our dead patients. They knew that they were killing a baby.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, because like you and I have talked about your story before, we've met in person at conferences and things like that, is it sounds from your story like this was almost standard practice. Like, I don't have time to hold this baby tonight. And so then can you do that? Like, there are medical professionals who for years before you discovered this, obviously, were just actually, cradling babies before they died as a matter of course. And this just didn't get discussed publicly until you started talking about it. Is that understanding correct?
Yes. When I eventually went public, when private appeals to the hospital didn't work, the news spread like wildfire across the U.S., and I was being interviewed from one end of the country to the other. And it turned out that this method of abortion that sometimes results in babies being aborted alive wasn't publicly known. And the first place that it was publicly known was at a hospital named Christ, which was just so inflammatory and blasphemous to Christians. And
right.
So, yes, this was when it first was publicized.
So just before we get into this phenomenon of babies being born alive after abortions and then left to die, or in certain instances that we know, like that instance in Texas, actively killed, when you left the morgue after basically dropping off this baby who had died in your arms, how did you go from there to deciding to go public, and what happened next? Because I remember when I started working in the pro-life movement, I actually didn't know your original story. I knew you as a pro-life blogger. Who several times a week at least were blogging on different things going on inside the pro-life movement, and you were one of the few pro-life bloggers out there. So tons of people read your blog. So how did you go from being a registered nurse who experienced this? How did you go public? What made you decide to? And so sort of give us that story in between rocking this dying child to becoming a well-known figure inside the pro-life movement.
Yeah, and just remind me to tell you about this specific procedure that results in babies being aborted alive, because I think that'll clarify to your viewers how this can possibly happen. Okay, yes. But in my case, I tried private appeals, a letter to the hospital. I was called in by my superiors. They said that it had been going on there for 20 years without a policy, and they weren't going to stop. Next, we asked a couple of influential people and organizations to privately appeal. I brought my pastor in on this, and we had determined to follow what Jesus said to do in Matthew 18. When you see someone in sin, first you go to them privately, then you take back a couple of witnesses privately, and then you go public if none of those work. Right. So Cardinal Francis George wrote to the hospital. Dr. C. Everett Koop, who was a former Surgeon General of the United States under President Reagan, and he was pro-life, appealed, but they didn't work. And that's when, we went public, as we told them we were going to do. I decided from the onset I wasn't going to be a shadowy figure, that it would be too hard. And then it would imply that I was uncomfortable with myself, and I wasn't at all. They were the ones who should be uncomfortable. So after 2 years, I got fired and did eventually get into blogging. My life took a complete turn after I held that baby, and I was instantly converted into a pro-life activist, and that's been the trajectory of my life since then. There's one question I wanted to ask in between there is that your revelation and the ensuing stories that came out of that revelation ended up resulting in the partial birth abortion ban signed by George W. Bush. I have two questions.
how did that process unfold? And then secondarily, and this is just a personal thing, regular listeners to this podcast will know that I've always been an enormous fan of George W. Bush as a person. Policy aside, I've always just really loved him. And one of the things that as grateful as I am for everything Donald Trump has done, I've always been somewhat resentful of this idea that we finally have a pro-life president and we didn't have one before. So I wanted to know, you had the opportunity to talk to George W. Bush. So what was talking to him about abortion like? Was this something he was genuinely passionate about?
I didn't ever have a close conversation with him, just with his people. And he was pro-life. I will say he was pro-life. And I admired, he did bring forth the Born Alive Infants Protection Act. He did sign it in 2002. And then later on, he signed the partial birth abortion ban in 2003. But on Donald Trump, he is just so proactive. I think saying that Trump is the most pro-life president we've ever had isn't to slight other presidents like President Bush and President Reagan. It's to say that he is fitting the mode that we've always hoped for, of being
right.
vocal about it, calling Hillary Clinton out in their debate that she just wants babies dismembered during the last trimester. And it was, she recoiled at that, but it was absolutely true. And when you called leaving abortion survivors to die execution, it was true. Calling out the Democrats for being so supportive of the worst parts of abortion, taxpayer funding of abortion. And he had another important thing that presidents do, and President Bush did do this to an extent, but President Trump is going gangbusters, is hiring people in the administration who are like-minded on abortion.
Right.
They set the policy. And so he has done that. Very good pro-life people. And he has issued executive orders and administrative orders that just about everything we've ever asked him to do, he's done.
Right. So just back to the thing.
Sorry if that was a segue unintended.
Yeah. No, well, you work for the SBA List, so I should have assumed that was coming if I mentioned anything political. So to backtrack a little bit, maybe you could explain for the listeners and the viewers about this abortion procedure that often results in babies being born alive and left to die, like 10 to 20% reported by the Chicago Sun-Times. That number is actually much higher than I thought. So we have statistics coming out regularly in Canada, and there's one really great pro-life blogger here in Canada named Pat Maloney, who has a blog called Run With Life, and she just basically submits these freedom of access to information reports year after year, gets the statistics and the reports and what she finds, and she found that about 150 babies, based on Stats Canada, were born alive and left to die after abortion procedures in 2018, and that's just the most recent number. It's now a regular thing that statistics come out here in Canada. It was 437 babies at one point. But stretching all the way back, we now know that in Canada, babies are regularly born alive and left to die after abortion procedures. Some people would say, look, there's 100,000 abortions in a year and only 150 are born alive and left to die. That's insane. The Canadian Criminal Code, which is functionally insane because it says that the child does not become a child until it exits the womb of its mother in a living form. So it has to fully exit the birth canal before it's a human being. So these babies are human beings, and we had a couple of members of parliament, what was this, I think 6 or 7 years ago, actually asked the RCMP to investigate this, and the whole thing was just completely ignored. So what is the abortion procedure that results in these children being born alive and left to die? And that side note there was just so that regardless of who's listening, wherever you are in North America, if you're in the States, if you're in Canada, this is happening at hospitals near you.
Yeah, people are familiar with the D&E abortion procedure, and that is for late-term babies, a little younger than the babies we're talking about, where the abortionist just basically takes like medical pliers and just rips arms and legs off the baby and then pulls the baby out. But when the baby's bones and muscles become too strong for them to do that, then that is one reason that they move to induced labor abortion. And to commit induced labor abortion, the abortionist inserts a medication in the mom's birth canal, up to the cervix, which is the opening that's supposed to stay closed until a mom is about 40 weeks pregnant.
Right.
When you're pregnant, your uterus is shaped kind of like a hot air balloon, and at the bottom is the cervix. So what these doctors are doing are trying to induce abortions on babies that are very young, who they don't think will survive past the procedure or much past it, or babies who are handicapped. And so they dilate the cervix, and so these babies who are fully formed but still very small, in essence, just fall out of the uterus, and that's how it comes to be that sometimes they're aborted alive. And my experience at Christ was that they aborted by this procedure, 19 and as late as 28 weeks. A baby who weighed over 2 pounds was delivered by this procedure and let die.
And so the child, the little boy that you were holding, that was the procedure they had used to abort him?
Yes,
right.
And that's how it happens.
So one of the things, I have to admit, it's interesting because when you're in the pro-life movement, you hear things that most people just don't hear. And so I remember when I first joined the pro-life movement in a full-time capacity, and I did a lot of traveling around the country. We would do, educational tours with abortion victim photography and the whole works. And one of the weirdest experiences for me was to have these people at your presentations come up to you, and they would tell you stories that would just rock you. And I'd be like, you've got to be kidding me. That doesn't happen, right? So I remember, this was in Kelowna. I had an elderly nurse come up and say, yeah, no, I remember how horrible abortion was when it first started. And I thought she was just referring to the sort of thing we had just talked about in our presentation. She said, yeah, I remember a baby being born alive, and the doctor panicked because he'd never had that before. And he threw the baby into the garbage can. So this baby would have been tiny, probably right around between 20 to 22 weeks. And she said, I can still remember hearing the rustling that the baby made in the papers in the wastebasket. And I remember just staring, and that is not the first time I've heard that story. Like, I have heard a number of stories now from medical professionals who are talking about babies who are born alive and left to die. And I'm sure you've seen that famous black and white photograph of a garbage bag filled with babies, of dead babies. That photograph was actually taken here in Toronto, Canada. Yeah, incidentally, that was the photograph, of course, that convicted Joe Scheider to join the pro-life movement. And so I knew intellectually that this was happening, but when you meet somebody who said, like, I heard a baby rustling in a waste paper basket, it just gives you such a different view of the country that you live in. So, like, what sort of stories, when you came forward, I know many other people came to you and said, I've had the same experience.
Right.
And so what sort of stories did you hear from hospitals across the U.S. after you came forward with your story?
Well, I had a coworker, Allison Baker, testify with me in Washington, D.C. about one time walking into the soiled utility room to find a live aborted baby laying naked on the scale, and another time to find a live aborted baby laying naked on the metal shelf next to the sink. And she said she herself inherited a patient one time who had just delivered a baby alive, aborted a baby alive, and the baby was in the soiled utility room because she didn't want anything to do with him. And so Allison still had to care for 2 patients, and she would go into the mom's room, and the mom would say to her, is he dead yet? Is he dead yet?
Wow.
And I had another experience that a nurse relayed to me. She said, Jill, I can't stop thinking about it. And this was the abortion of a baby who was just over 23 weeks old. And the line of viability in 99 was 23 weeks or a pound, right around those, the weight or age, meaning
right.
At that point, the babies were considered resuscitatable. So this baby was right on that line. The mom wasn't going to be able to complete her pregnancy to term. So because she was at a hospital that offered choices, my friend said, the doctor said to her, do you want to, try to hold on, and we'll give you medications to try and strengthen the baby's lungs, give the baby a fighting chance, or you just want to abort, you just want to get it over with. And she said, yeah, I just want to abort. So she wanted everything done for the baby. 4 specialists from the neonatal unit would have been sent over just specifically to care for this baby. But because she wasn't wanted, the only people present at her delivery was my nurse friend and an OBGYN resident. She was aborted alive. She began thriving on her own. Her APGAR scores improved between 1 and 5 minutes, meaning she was showing signs of perking up without any help. And nothing was done for her. She was just kept in the department and rocked for the 2.5 hours that she lived.
Wow. Now, yeah. On a darker note, I remember the live action. I think this was their last big undercover investigation. So this would have been, ironically, actually, this would be in 2013 while the Kermit Gosnell trial was going on. And I'm sure everybody listening and watching knows what the Kermit Gosnell trial was. I actually went to the final day of the Kermit Gosnell trial to watch it unfold. But for those who don't know, he was a Philadelphia abortionist who perfected a process of abortion where he would just deliver the babies alive. He'd flip them over, stick scissors in the back of their neck, cut their spinal cords, and they would suffocate to death. He was also guilty of, I believe in the court documents, it said something like over 100 fetal beheadings, which is basically decapitating children. But on the way back from the trial, we stopped in Washington, D.C., and there was a Stop the Killing rally going on in front of a massive abortion complex, a Planned Parenthood in Washington, D.C., with live action. And so there was a whole bunch of pro-lifers there protesting. And what they were protesting was that the abortionist at this abortion clinic had said that he would actively kill the babies after they were born. I believe, don't quote me on it because I haven't seen that piece of journalism in a little bit. I believe he was the one who drowned the babies after they came out alive. But then there was in the same investigation, there was the Texas abortionist who strangled one of the children who came out alive. Well, that whole investigation was like just from horror to horror. And I haven't seen anything so horrifying until the David Daleiden Center for Medical Progress expose came out in 2015. What do you know in your research and through your experience about the babies that are born alive after abortions not being left to die but actively killed? Because I know you blogged a lot on that. You did a lot of research into this area. And just so our listeners really understand this, I know this is a very dark and macabre topic, but right now, as we just discussed, this stuff is being read out in court in San Francisco, and nobody's talking about it, and the mainstream media is pretending it's not happening. So it's really important to talk about it.
Yeah, Jonathan, I think the videos by Center for Medical Progress are unveiling things, of course, you and I never knew about, needing to harvest organs. I'm sure you're going to get into of living babies. I can only speak to, since I never observed outright killing, but I can only speak to what you've also heard. You and I have both heard incidences, both in court, and then the nurses at that clinic in Houston took pictures of babies. So yeah, so that's really my I don't have direct knowledge of babies being outright killed.
Right. Just from the live action investigation. I believe that investigation was called Inhuman. It's their 2013 investigation for anybody who wants to look it up. It is still, in fact, on YouTube. So when we're looking at...
To stop there, that investigation was pretty much totally about abortionists, what they would do in the event that a baby was aborted alive. And so several abortionists said they would either kill the baby or set the baby aside to die. But no, in doing that, they were admitting that, yeah, it happens.
Which it's sort of interesting because the media goes into damage control whenever pro-lifers expose something like this. And one of the most interesting things to me about that is not that they say pro-lifers are lying, because they have to, right? They have to say our pictures are fake, because otherwise they have to grapple with the fact that the pictures of aborted babies might be real. They have to say David Daleiden's lying, or they have to explain how they can justify harvesting organs from living children. Like, they have to deny these things because that's really their only option at this point. But what's interesting to me is that so many abortion workers and abortionists have come out and said these things, right? So if you're not going to listen to the pro-life movement, not just even the former abortionists like Dr. Bernard Nathanson, but I had Abby Johnson on the podcast when her film just came out a few months ago, and she told me one story that I hadn't even read in her book or on her blog, where this woman who was pregnant with quadruplets, the children literally just started falling out of her, right? And she ran a Planned Parenthood clinic in D.C. She saw this happen. Carol Everett, same thing, ran 3 clinics in Texas and tells stories that will make your blood run cold. And so why do you think it is that they even ignore people in their own industry? Well, and some of the best footage, I'll take this moment to say that we have a very, very strange job. But when I say best footage for David Daleiden, I mean, they leaked they leaked this massive amount of footage that he wasn't allowed to release, and I downloaded the torrent, and then I watched the whole footage. I think I watched like 17 hours of it or something, and in that footage, you see him at the NAF workshops, the National Abortion Federation, and you see these discussions between abortionists, and that stuff didn't get reported on because there was jokes about eyeballs falling into laps. Remember that one abortionist was like, "Yeah, what do you do when an eyeball falls in your lap?" And she and everybody laughs like, "Yeah, I know what you mean when the eyeball falls out of the head of a baby." And this stuff was and then when they laughed, it sounded hellish because of the thing they were discussing, like eyeballs falling out of babies, right? Like it's dolls missing an eye are creepy. You know what I mean? Like that's the stuff of horror films. The stuff they're talking about is actually happening, and it's just sort of horrifying. And you spent a lot of time on the media side of things blogging because you had one of the most well-read pro-life blogs in the U.S. for quite a number of years. What was your experience trying to push this into the mainstream conversation, and what do you think it will take for the mainstream media to cover this if they won't even cover it when it's an abortionist, a still practicing abortionist, in California on the stand testifying that this does happen, admitting it, and the guy's done 50,000 abortions. If you can't listen to him, who are you going to listen to?
Well, that was a two-part question, and the first part is that I ran into first people not either believing this story or just wanting to cast it aside when State Senator Barack Obama was running for the U.S. Senate in 2004. Now, I live in Illinois, and I had testified before him on 3 different committees on Born Alive bill that was introduced in Illinois that was similar to the federal bill, and he voted against it 4 times. And he even testified on the floor of the Senate saying that giving these born babies we're talking about the same rights, he said, as full-term wanted babies, he said, would lead to the overturn of Roe v. Wade. And so that's why he said he voted against it. So he was even willing to advocate infanticide, and that's what we called him when he was running for Senate and president. He was
and to be clear, didn't even Hillary Clinton vote for this one?
Yes, on the federal level, the identical bill that was introduced in Illinois was unanimously supported in the Senate. Biden, Clinton, Boxer, Kennedy, the worst of the worst, all of them voted for it because they realized even if they really had not wanted to vote for it, that it was a step too far. And NARAL went neutral on that bill too. But that was kidding. People didn't. We had videotape, not video, audio tape of what then State Senator Barack Obama said. We had his testimony written out. I have links. My blog is still live, archived, and there is an icon in the top right where you can go and read 3 or 4 different times when Obama opposed the Born Alive Act in Illinois. But people either it was too bizarre for them, or they just didn't want to believe it. And actually, that is the dynamic that we're working with on a larger scale of people think that abortion is wrong. They think that it's murder if you ask them that question in a poll. Yet they also are confused because then they hear about, well, what about, the babies who are the products of rape and incest? And so they don't know what to do with this information. They're against it, but they feel sorry for the moms, and so they just shut down and go in denial. And so it's the Pontius Pilate defense. I don't like what you're doing, but okay, go ahead. So what we have to do as a pro-life movement is convince these, get them to think about it again. And what I've been finding during that time was that they didn't want to think about it, but I think they're thinking about it more. And I forgot the second part of your question.
Second part of the question is, how do you get the media to actually address the fact that this is happening? And just I'll add an addendum to that question, because you mentioned at the beginning of this interview, Governor Ralph Northam essentially admitting that this does happen, that babies are born alive after abortion attempts and left to die, or the doctor and the parents decide together whether or not the child will be left to die. And I remember when that came out, and I was stunned, and the entire media ran defense almost immediately. And they basically did everything that it took to not talk about how barbaric this was. They did the same thing when New York passed their abortion till birth bill. They like this year, you've had so many Democrats let the mask slip and come out and say, no human rights before birth. None. And like after birth, we'll occasionally give you a pass if you didn't manage to get the abortion finished in time. And you've seen just how corrupt the media is, where they run total defense and they nitpick words. So I remember when Trump came out and he quoted Ralph Northam's words and said, this is like executing the baby. And they're like, not technically executing because they're leaving it to die and, you know, not shooting it or whatever. So it's not technically execution. But if the next question to the media would have been, well, so is leaving it to die then killing the baby through negligence? No, that neither. Like they just refuse to sort of address the question. They just rebut wherever they can, right? You had that one idiot doctor, Dr. Jen Gunter, who actually called heartbeat bills fetal pole cardiac activity bills. Like they'll do anything to dehumanize the preborn child. So you've been through the media firestorms on Born Alive and Left to Die after you came public with your story. You now work for the Susan B. Anthony List, which has been working hard on a bunch of pieces of legislation related to this issue. We've had governors and Democrats basically come out and admit they support this, or at least will do nothing to stop it over the past 9 months. What can we do to get the media to actually cover this stuff, or is it simply not going to happen?
Well, it's basic fact that we all know that the mainstream media is liberal, it's biased, and mainstream media is pro-abortion. I have read articles from before 1973 that showed you didn't know at that time that the media was biased, but they were advocating for a legalized abortion way before an LA Times article, I specifically recall. So if the abortion industry, if pro-abortion ideologues admit that any part of abortion is wrong, they open up a can of worms that they don't want to open up. If they say that partial birth abortion is wrong, well, why is it wrong? And if they, well, the baby's, you know, an older baby, well, then at what age is the baby not a baby? They just can't go there. So they shut down, the media shut this down. But I will say that despite the liberal bias this year, because as you said, so many Democrat candidates have let reality show that they do support abortion throughout all 9 months, paid for by the taxpayers, and taking away protections for babies who are aborted alive. They are letting this show, and the media is even, I have several articles where the media says, you know, they're really opening the door here for Republicans to capitalize on it, or they're putting themselves in a place they may not want to be in after the primary's over. So there is some objectivity we're starting to see now, but of course, not enough.
Yeah, one of the final things I wanted to get into with you in this interview, because of your work with the SBA List, is I know that there's been another Born Alive Survivors Protection Act put forward.
Yeah.
I saw a wonderful speech on that act by Senator Ben Sass. Am I saying his name right?
Yeah.
Ben Sass from Nebraska.
Yeah.
He's, I think, one of my favorite senators. He writes a book a year too, and his books are phenomenal. And his speech on abortion was just exceptional. And what I was wondering, because I work in the movement and I wasn't able to quite figure it out, is if Bush already signed one of these bills, why is another one necessary? Are we closing down loopholes, or are we basically just trying to push this into public consciousness to alert them to what's going on and move the Overton window towards the pro-life position in that fashion?
The Born Alive Infants Protection Act, which he signed into law in 2002, was a definitions bill. It was just a simple 3-sentence bill that said any baby born alive, no matter what gestational age, no matter what reason for being aborted, is a constitutionally protected person. But it didn't say, if you violate these babies' rights, this will happen to you. So now, 20 years later, almost, the bill called the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, which is like the other half of this bill, has been presented. And this is a bill that would provide prosecutions and fine. You'll go to prison if you do this. You'll be fined. Even the mother can sue you, because we do know of moms who, when they see their live babies, they have an immediate change of heart. So it's just the other side of the original Born Alive.
Okay. So final question, tell us a bit about your work at the Susan B. Anthony List. It's an organization, I think the work they do is phenomenal. The amount of door knocking that they get accomplished and the effectiveness that they wield on the federal level, getting pro-life policies through. I'm also, of course, probably a little bit biased towards the organization because multiple people that I'm friends with work there, including our mutual friend, Andy Moore, who's your son-in-law that I've been friends with for years. He does amazing work for the SBA List. But for our listeners who don't know much about the SBA List, give us the plug for what SBA List does and why it's so effective.
Well, thanks. SBA List is the United States' largest pro-life political organization, and we focus on passing pro-life legislation, halting pro-abortion legislation, and elective pro-life legislators. Then making sure that once they're elected, they follow they toe the line. And if they wiggle, then we work to take them out. So one of the most effective things that we've been doing since 2012 is, as you said, during election years, picking states where we think that we can make the difference on the margins as in a presidential election or congressional election. And we focus on the Senate. Because the presidency and the Senate are how you confirm conservative judges, and that's what it's going to take in order to stop this mass killing of babies, really. So we approach specific voters, either pro-life Republicans who don't vote as often as they should, or pro-life Democrats and independents who, by modeling, look like they could be persuaded if they only knew how bad their party was on abortion, because again, the media doesn't get it out enough. And we've been very successful. 15 out of 18 races we've won between 2012 and 2018. And now we're in 9 states for the 2020 election is just very important. We just have to, we're at a pivotal point here where this is what the pro-life movement has worked for in the U.S. since Roe v. Wade. And we have a majority of pro-life justices, pro-life president and Senate who can continue to confirm sane justices. And if in 2020 we don't get that again, then everything that we've worked for could be just sent backward. So this is a very important, they're all very important. We always say that, but this is a very important election for the pro-life movement.
I'll ask one final question because a lot of our listeners might find this interesting. Is the sort of the evangelical movement, the pro-life movement? A lot of people harp on the significance of that movement to Trump's election. In your view, how significant was the pro-life vote to President Donald Trump's election on November of 2016?
It was very significant. For instance, in Florida, he only won by 12,000 votes. And that year, we visited over 500,000 voters in 2016 in Florida. 2018, Scott in Florida only won by 10,000 votes. So we were the margin of victory. You know, we can say that pretty much everywhere. President Trump knows that we're his base, and he appreciates us. And you can see by his actions and his words that he respects and isn't trying to advance the pro-life cause. So I
remember that, yes.
Support him back. He was, when it came, there were 17 people running in 2016 on the Republican side. And he was really our last choice. Marjorie even came out against him when he became the only choice between me and Hillary, there was no choice. And
you were just saying that Trump was the last
chairman
choice
of his pro-life committee. So, given his history, we were unsure, but the pro-life movement has to do a better job of welcoming in converts. We're always suspicious, but we just have to, they're like people who have been evangelized, and so they may not know how to say things the right way. But we have to give them a break and encourage them. And that's what we've done with President Trump too. And he has said that the pro-life issue is going to be one of the main issues of his 2020 election campaign. So he knows, and that's also good for our movement because as you talked about a few minutes ago, they don't want to talk about it. The more that we talk about it, the more that we use the right words, the more we win.
Yeah. Well, Jill, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this very depressing topic, but very important topic for everybody to hear about.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jonathan.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was my conversation with Jill Stanek of the Susan B. Anthony list on babies being born alive and left to die after abortions and the horrifying things being perpetrated by the abortion industry right across North America. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to check out past shows, go to lifesitenews.com and click on the podcast tab. If you don't prefer to watch a podcast, you can listen on iTunes, SoundCloud. We're on all the major podcast platforms. And if you want to read any breaking commentary on any of the major pro-life and pro-family stories, again, head to lifesitenews.com. Thank you so much for joining us again this week, and we hope you'll join us again next week.